A lot of attention. A U.S. man who spent more than 4 decades in solitary confinement will remain there for at least 2 more days. This comes after the Louisiana Attorney General's office was granted an emergency stay, blocking the release of Albert Woodfox. An appeals court granted the stay until at least Friday.
The 68-year-old is the last imprisoned member of the so-called Angola 3, accused of the 1972 killing of a prison guard. He was convicted twice, but both convictions have since been overturned. Both Amnesty International and the United Nations have labeled Woodfox's imprisonment inhumane because of the length of time he spent in solitary confinement.
And studies have shown that prolonged periods of solitary confinement can cause mental and physical breakdowns, even mental illness. We want to speak about this a bit more in depth, so we've invited psychologist Dr. Erik to join us here at CNN Center, because you hear about a man who has spent more than 40 years in solitary confinement. There's some legal wrangling about when, if and when he will get out. But if he does get out, what kind of life could he face? What psychologically does being trapped in, what was it, a 6 by 9 foot cell do to a human?
Well, I think what we have to look at is, when you look at studies that they've done on confinement, there's a couple conditions. One is, first, you have people who have consented to do a study. You have to consent. And they're in there for maybe 10 days, I think, is some of the longer studies. And what they found is that there isn't long-term deficits of that. But when you're looking at long-term, years and years, you know, months, let alone years, you're talking about somebody who has sensory deprivation issues. Their cognitive function is decreased. EEG results of confinement have showed decreased brain activity over, we're just talking a few months of confinement. And again, when you look at the complications of years of that, depression, anxiety, issues with anger outbursts and rage outbursts, that you have physical complications. People with premorbid conditions of mental illness often have complications of those issues, as well as sometimes hallucinations and delusions.
Wow.
Sometimes when people get out, some of their symptoms abate, but their ability to reconnect to people is hampered. And this is similar to attachment disorders in children who have been raised in orphanages and haven't had meaningful human contact. We are social animals, and we connect together, and that's an important aspect of this to look at.
So then walk us through the process, I guess, of rehabilitating someone like that into society, sort of reintroducing them into society. What sort of therapy should they undergo?
Well, unfortunately, what happens is people who go through this situation, there usually is no rehabilitation or reintegration. In this situation, he may be released and just put back in society because, well, okay, sorry, you know, kind of that's how they work that out sometimes. But this person needs serious therapy. They need to be thoroughly evaluated first to really see what's happened to them emotionally, cognitively, looking at their neuropsychological state and functioning, their relationships and attachments, and then they need to be slowly reintegrated with the people, because...
So it's a process, you've got to do it slowly then, okay?
Absolutely. And even with the sensory issues, being around a few people can be overwhelming, let alone being in crowds of people.
So considering it sounds like what you're saying is it breaks you as a human to be stuck in such a place for such a long amount of time, and you say there are limited studies indicating that. Why do we confine people? Why is that an appropriate punishment? I mean, I don't know if you can speak to that, but what does that really do to anybody?
If you look at the idea of when we do timeouts with kids, we send them to their room for a little bit. We think it gives them time to think about things, and to then hopefully they'll think about and work through their problems.
And change their behavior is the hope.
Exactly. So the thought is, well, here's somebody who's done something really bad. If we put them in isolation, maybe they'll really think about it, and the longer you put them in, then maybe they'll change. But there have been no positive results found in studies of confinement.
Wow.
So neutral results, but more negative outcomes. There is often an increase in violence in prisons when people are released from solitary confinement, and more outbreaks of physical violence than there are those who are in general population. So we have increases in the negative outcomes.
So we know that Woodfox was allowed to exercise. We know that he was allowed to watch television, and he was allowed, I believe, 1 hour a day to walk outside. Does that change anything in terms of his ability or to rehabilitate back into society? Does that help? How much does it help?
I don't really believe it helps that much, because it's the human interaction, the conversations back and forth, the ability to allow yourself to reflect off of somebody else and have them feed back to you. That's integral, as well as human touch. You know, touching somebody is important, and you don't get that in solitary confinement. And 1 hour a day is really meaningless.
Gosh, it really makes you think how lucky we are to be able to interact and have those social interactions every single day.
But fascinating, you say no real net benefit to these confinements based on studies, maybe equalized, but no improvement. Dr. Erik Fisher, psychologist, thanks for coming down to the CNN Center. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay.